tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Honor to him, the blessed one, the worthy one, the fully enlightened one. My utmost respect to the perfectly enlightened Sammasambuddha, the noble doctrine of the Buddha, and the noble Mahasangha, the disciples of the Buddha. Dear Dhamma friends, welcome to our 24th guest lecture series, a program organized by Dhamma USA. Please mark your calendar every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time to attend these guest lecture series. Kindly check with Dhamma USA YouTube channel, Facebook page, and Facebook groups for more updates. Also, please post your questions in the comment sections of Dhamma USA YouTube channel and Facebook page so that our guest lecturer can answer them at the end of the talk. Today's topic is Buddhism and Deep Ecology, Sustainable Relationships within the Sangha of All Beings. Our special guest speaker tonight is Professor Tom Moritz. Professor Moritz is a longtime Buddhist practitioner who has served as adjunct professor Professor Moritz is a longtime Buddhist practitioner who has served as adjunct professor at the University of the West for 10 years in the area of psychology, divinity, and environmental studies. He has worked in natural history for over 50 years from the local to the international level. Since completing a graduate degree in 1974, he has been committed to the sharing of knowledge resources as broadly as possible, and particularly committed to the application of new and emergent digital technologies to support knowledge sharing. Please welcome Professor Moritz. Good evening, Professor. It's an honor to have you here today. We hope you're doing well.
Yeah, thank you. It's very good to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak again for Dhamma USA. I wanted to mention that my topic tonight is in a way a continuation of a previous talk that I gave here, which was focused on sustainability and equanimity. And so I'm very, very happy to be able to extend those original comments. I also want to let you know that these are in many ways some preliminary thoughts, as was my last talk, but they are moving in a very, I hope what will be a clear direction towards something more like a comprehensive study. Anyway, I love the opening slide that I've got here. It's a beautiful, beautiful image of the Buddha wrapped inside the roots of a tree. And in many ways, it's symbolic of the topic that I'm going to be addressing tonight. How do we change slides? Sorry, I can do it. I see. There we go. Sorry, folks. So first, I wanted to show you this image. For those of you who are not in Southern California, this is an image of Mount Wilson, which is one of the highest peaks in the Front Range of the San Gabriel Mountains. And this view that we're seeing is from University of the West in Rosemead, where both Bhante Sumita and I have spent quite a lot of time in the last 10 years at least. And what you're seeing, of course, is snowfall at the top of the mountain. The Mount Wilson is about 6,000 feet high. And it is possible, by the way, to drive all the way to the top. You're seeing up here at the very top a number of different antennae. And there's even a very large originally Caltech observatory. It's where the Big Bang Theory was first developed by Professor Hubble back in the 1920s, 1930 or thereabouts. And also Albert Einstein visited there. It's quite an amazing location. But it's also in this image, I'm showing you this image because these mountains have been a part of my life. since I grew up probably somewhere down below between where I'm standing when I took this picture and this mountain, right down in this area. And so since at the very least, since my teenage years, this has been a view that I've grown up with. I also spent a lot of time in these mountains, and familiarity with any natural environment can be a very, very important part of our spiritual development. And I'll try and talk about that more. First of all, I thought it might be useful just to talk about what deep ecology is. And deep ecology is a philosophical position that was developed by a Norwegian philosopher and ecologist named Arne Næss. He left us probably about 2006, I believe. But his first presentation of deep ecology occurred about 1968. And throughout his life, he was an advocate and a very dynamic author, talking about what he considered to be the basic principles of deep ecology. He also, by the way, was a Gandhian scholar. He wrote books about Mahatma Gandhi and about Satyagraha. And so he was quite a remarkable human being. So these are the basic principles of deep ecology. And the fundamental tenet of deep ecology is that there are actually, excuse me, two types of ecology. There's what Næss called shallow ecology, and then there's what he termed deep ecology. The shallow ecology reflects a willingness to use the earth and living beings on the earth and the resources of the earth only for human purposes. That name, natural resources, that many of us have heard, reflects the understanding that the earth itself and the living beings on the earth are here to serve human beings. There's a long tradition there, but it also could be called anthropocentrism or human-centeredness. Næss propounded an alternative, which he called biocentrism, and it reflects the belief that all forms of life on earth are worthy of equitable respect and preservation. So his first principle is that the well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on earth have value in themselves. These values are independent of the usefulness, the utility of the non-human world for human purposes. So he's saying that the issue is not that there's intrinsic value in the biosphere, essentially. He says diversity, that is the richness and diversity of life forms, contribute to the realization of these values and are also values in themselves. So what we now call biodiversity, the richness and diversity of life forms, is an intrinsic value. And he says, as third point, humans have no right to reduce this richness and diversity except to satisfy vital needs. That last clause is an interesting one, which we may talk about. Populations, the flourishing of human life and culture is compatible with a substantial decrease of human population. The flourishing of non-human life requires such a decrease. So there is a powerful argument against continued expansion of human population. The UN has recently said that we've reached 8 billion people on this planet. And Næss is arguing that there's a severe problem with the continued expansion of human population. Fifth point is human interference. And it says the present human interference with the non-human world is excessive and the situation is rapidly worsening. The most conspicuous form of this these days is actually climate change, where we're seeing the effects of climate change all over our planet. And it's been predicted now since at least 1988, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change first began reporting, which was formed from the UN Development Agency and the World Meteorological Association, the UN Development Program, I'm sorry, and the World Meteorological Association began predicting and projecting the impacts of climate change as a result of human action on Earth. It's, in other words, anthropogenic, that is, humans have caused it. Then he says in point 6, policies must be changed, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the way policies are changed and how do we arrive, what are the fundamental bases for implementing policy. Quality of life, the ideological change is mainly that of appreciating life quality, dwelling in situations of inherent value, rather than adhering to an increasingly higher standard of living. So he's making a very fundamental point. As some of us know, Bhutan has a index of gross domestic happiness, and Bhutan, of course, is one country in the Mahasangha. And then last, it says that there's an obligation to act. Those who subscribe to the foregoing points have an obligation directly or indirectly to try and implement change. So these are the basic principles. We'll be coming back to those as we go forward. This one is an image from the Chauvet Caves in France. I believe this to be it's an exquisite piece of human art, but this is 35,000 years old. And what you're seeing in this image is, in this one area, 4 horse heads that are just beautiful. They could be contemporary art. Here we see rhinoceroses here fighting. They're actually in combat. They're probably 2 males attacking each other, and then there are other animals in this slide. And this cave, which was discovered only about 1990, if I'm not mistaken, is full of these just exquisite pictures. And this image comes from Werner Herzog's film, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is a wonderful, wonderful film. And there is a link to that film, by the way, on the slide. Of course, here's an image that's very familiar to many of us. This is Nalagiri, the elephant. And what you're seeing is the Buddha blessing Nalagiri. And I want to note one other thing. If you notice in the background, here is a mother with her baby running away because she's in terror of this great elephant. And yet the Buddha has his hand extended and is blessing Nalagiri. I want to contrast this with this, just briefly with this. This is a famous short story by the progressive British writer George Orwell, who also wrote 1984 An Animal Farm. But he served in Burma as an agent of British imperialism. And the story that he presents here is about actually being constrained because of his position as a British administrator to kill an elephant. A male elephant had gone into must, had killed a villager in the area of South Burma where he lived. And despite the fact that he didn't believe there was any reason to kill it, he felt constrained by the circumstances of his position as an imperialist administrator, and not to humiliate himself or the British Empire in front of the Burmese people that were there. And so he shot this elephant. So I want to just point out clearly the distinction between this image of the Buddha with his hand on the forehead of an elephant and this story by George Orwell, which was from the 1930s, of having to shoot and kill a very similar elephant who had done pretty much the same thing that Nalagiri had done. In fact, almost exactly the same thing. It seemed the elephant had gone into must. So now I'm going to just briefly refresh our thinking about the sources in Buddhism for love for all beings. For the first precept essentially calls for, my teacher Bhikkhu Bodhi suggests that we call this harmlessness, that harmlessness is a good single phrase for the first precept. But this is from Sulak Sivarasta. And it says, to refrain from the killing is the first Buddhist precept. The Theravada tradition interprets this precept in terms that parallel a Western sense of morality. There is a clear-cut distinction between killing and not killing, in which the existence of a breathing, moving being either comes to its end or doesn't. So very clearly, what we just saw was a violation of that precept. But it is a fundamental precept, and the precepts are common to virtually all parts of Buddhism throughout the Mahasangha. Also, wanted to note this comment about right livelihood. This is actually a reflection on wrong livelihood. Sama ajiva. Monks and lay followers should not engage in 5 types of business. Which 5? Business in weapons, business in human beings, business in meat, business in intoxicants, and business in poisons. In many respects, our contemporary world culture is violating all 5 of these basic elements of right livelihood. We'll talk more about that in a minute too. Then I wanted to bring this from the Metta-Karaniya Sutta, the Loving Kindness Sutta. Wishing in this is an excerpt from the, I won't do the whole sutta here, but wishing in gladness and in safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they are weak or strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, elephants, medium, short, or small, mice, the seen and the unseen, those living near and far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. Let none deceive another or despise any being in any state. Let none through anger or ill will wish harm upon another. Even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world. So that's a very, very firm commitment to love and compassion for all beings that we live with. This is a slightly more recent Zen koan, sometimes called Joshu's dog or Jiaozhou's dog. And the question, the koan is, a monk asked Jiaozhou, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Jiaozhou said, mu. Mu can mean not, it could mean a rejection of the question itself, or it could be an answer, it could mean no, or it could be both. I'm not here to talk about the koan dimension of this, but I am here saying that I think it's very touching to me that monks in China in around 800 AD were considering the question of whether dogs might have Buddha nature. I think it's a very interesting question, which to my mind flows very naturally from the other aspects of the Buddhist tradition. The Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, many of us know of Ashoka. He was the last of the Mauryan dynasty in India, and he was a Buddhist. He was converted to Buddhism after having had a very successful military career. And this reflects back on the deep ecology, Arnie Ness's mention of the importance of policy. As long as this is roughly 265 to 238 years before the Christian era. So this is almost 2,300 years ago. The Emperor Ashoka published edicts around his empire, on the borders of his empire. There were stelae and in some cases they were published in Amharic and Greek, not just in his own language. And this is from one of the edicts. Everywhere has beloved of the gods, King Piyadasi, that's Ashoka, made provision for 2 types of medical treatment. Medical treatment for humans and medical treatment for animals. Wherever medical herbs suitable for humans or animals are not available, I have had them imported and grown. Wherever medical roots or fruits are not available, I've had them imported and grown. Along roads, I've had wells and trees planted for the benefit of humans and animals. Amazing, given the dilemma we seem to have, at least in the United States, over the provision of health care for human beings, certainly for provision of dental care. King Ashoka, a long time ago, more than 2 millennia ago, determined that it was essential not only to provide health care for human beings, but for animals as well within his kingdom. Touches my heart very deeply to read that. Just a couple of other sources. Mahavira was a contemporary of the Buddha, and of course he is considered to be the patriarch of the Jain tradition, and Jains have developed a very strong commitment to non-harming of all life forms. So this was part of the context in India at that time. And then Mahatma Gandhi, fast forwarding into the 20th century, had a very strong commitment to harmlessness, to ahimsa, not harming. Ahimsa means not to harm. And people who visited his ashrams were often shocked that he let scorpions and snakes and insects just go through the ashram without being harmed. And it is the story then that no one was ever actually harmed by any of those creatures that he allowed to be. And one of the visitors at his ashram describes finding a scorpion in his boot, his shoes, and he simply released it. So, Gandhi, of course, had many other dimensions of his philosophy and his activity, but he was committed to harmlessness. One other important element in the Western tradition, St. Francis, who was considered a heretic, actually not an Orthodox Catholic in many respects, and still is considered a heretic by many. He believed, this is a picture of St. Francis giving a sermon to birds, and there's a story about that. My brother and sister birds, you should raise your voices. You should praise your creator and always love him. He gave you feathers for clothes, wings to fly, and other things that you need. And it's told that he spoke to fish too. There's a story of him finding a fish trap in a river and releasing the fish and telling them to be more wise the next time and not to get caught in the trap. I'm sure the fishermen didn't like that. But that's actually, by the way, what we're talking about here. It's a very interesting question. Coming forward into the virtually the present, this is from 1979. The Australian philosopher Peter Singer talks about, here we go. There we go. He talks about not just the right that human beings have to equity and equality, but he suggests that by extension it follows that animals and plants should too. It's a very powerful argument. And Singer is now at Princeton University, and his book, Animal Liberation, has been widely influential. All right. Another practice that I was introduced to about 30 years ago when I took the precepts with Thich Nhat Hanh is the practice of touching the earth. I'm not going to go through it here, but if you follow this link, you can find 2 examples of earth touchings, which are ways of demonstrating devotionally our respect for the earth and for all beings on the earth. And this is a statement that came out in 2012. An important group of neuroscientists, some of whom I think are mentioned here, created what they called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. I mentioned this in my last talk, but what they say here is that the absence of a neocortex, that is a human-type brain module, does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective states. That's a very important statement, a very compassionate statement about other beings. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. And this was issued in Cambridge in 2012. So a very brief digression into science as a way of knowing. I personally love this slide. What it tells us basically is that here's the real world, which if it were drawn to scale, of course, would be miles and miles across. But the real world is the basis of observations and data, collection of data, which are then rationally analyzed and proposed as hypotheses, as information. And then after a process of conceptual evaluation and testing, they are often accorded the standard of knowledge. They're said that we now know this. But the critical piece, and the piece that we're really here to talk about today, is how do we go from knowledge to wisdom? What are the criteria? What is wisdom? And from a Buddhist perspective, it's very clear. Wisdom means the elimination of suffering. It means that the policies that we make, the actions that we take, the actions that we endorse consciously, intentionally, and volitionally reduce suffering in the world. So it's one thing to say that we have tremendous knowledge, which we do, by the way, but it's a whole nother question about, the question becomes, and I'll give you a simple example that I often use with my classes. We know exactly how cholera is created. There's a bacterium, Vibrio cholerae, that creates cholera. And we now know that it's waterborne. And so that was reasonably concluded in the mid-1800s. Even in England, there was a problem getting the London Board of Health to accept that that was scientific reality. But here's the problem. We still have cholera in countries like Nepal. I was in Nepal in 1994, and at that time, there were no samples of water in Kathmandu that were clean by World Health Organization standards. And not only that, but when the big earthquake happened in Haiti around 2012, Nepali soldiers went to Haiti and by accident brought cholera with them. And Haiti had never had cholera, and a cholera epidemic broke out in Haiti after that. So the question is, relevant to that little narrative I just gave you, since we had knowledge, an Italian scientist had actually presented a slide showing the cholera bacteria in 1855, and we soon developed knowledge about how cholera was spread, how it could be prevented, how it could be treated. Why was it that thousands and thousands of people in Haiti died of cholera in the last decade? That, to me, is a gap between knowledge and wisdom. And the question becomes, how do we move toward wiser policy based on the knowledge that we possess? Just a quick example of how this is what our ancestors saw when they looked at the night sky. There's Jupiter and there's Saturn. So for millions, well, hundreds of thousands of years, certainly tens of thousands of years, our ancestors, Homo sapiens, saw this. They had no other devices, no other ways of looking at the sky. Then Galileo developed a telescope. He actually developed it, by the way, for military reasons, but he also pointed it at the sky. And this is a rough approximation of what Galileo saw when he looked at Saturn. He began to see that Saturn probably had rings, and he hypothesized that it had rings. Of course, now we know this to be what Saturn looks like because we have very high power telescopes. And not only that, but we've actually flown devices through the rings of Saturn. So over the period of about 300 or 400 years since Galileo, well, let's see, that would have been 1600 roughly to now, 400 years, we've moved from a very primitive sense of what Saturn looked like to very highly documented and researched understanding of what Saturn looks like. And I'm using this simply as a typology, as an example of the way scientific knowledge has advanced in general. This is one of a very lovely image about evolution of species. When we think about ourselves, and particularly if we're talking about anthropocentrism, it's not likely, to my mind, that human beings have some kind of exclusive or standing in the natural world, or that we should have dominion over the natural world. These are four animals. We're one of them, human beings: cats, bats, porpoises, and horses. And we all have analogous forelimbs, right? This is the hand, forearm, and upper arm. The cat paw, forearm, and upper arm. This is a bat, a flying mammal. This is the equivalent of our human hand, forearm, and upper arm. This is a porpoise. Similarly, and there's a horse. Similarly, clearly we are all closely related, and it doesn't take a genius to recognize that similarity. And this is a famous picture from Thomas Huxley, who's often called Darwin's bulldog, showing 5 primates, including us, gorillas, chimpanzees, with whom we share over 98% of our genetic material, orangutans, and gibbons. It doesn't take a genius to look at this and say, of course, we're related. We're related. And by the way, the famous gorilla scientist or observer, Diane Fossey, took her African cook out to see gorillas for the first time. And when he saw them, he said, he almost under his breath, he said, "Surely, God, they are my kin." He knew intuitively when he first saw a gorilla that we were all kin. There was a kinship between us. And I'll just show you this quickly. This is the oldest human footprint that we know of on Earth. It's about 3.6 million years ago. It's at Laetoli in Tanzania. That's what the footprint tracks look like. And that's a reconstruction by the American Museum of Natural History, where I used to work. We now believe there were 3. There was a mother, a father, and a child, all walking and leaving their footprints in that mud that created that trackway that we see there. But this is the first evidence we have of human footprints and of human bipedality, humans walking upright. So the question then becomes, and we've talked about this in my previous lecture, dukkha is often simplistically defined as suffering. But in this essay by Francis Story, which was published by the Buddhist Publication Society in Sri Lanka, dukkha is the equivalent of disturbance, irritation, dejection, worry, despair, fear, dread, anguish, anxiety. Goes on and on. All the sources of disequilibrium in human beings can be considered dukkha. So the traditional definition of dukkha, of dukkha is hardly adequate. And so the question that I want to ask is, this is actually the question that we're raising here. Is it possibility to have an economy of kindness? And since dukkha has all these different qualities, a question to ask is, do all beings suffer? And it seems to me, obviously, that they do. And specifically, these are some of the instances that have troubled me in the past. Do predators suffer? In other words, do large animals that kill other animals suffer as a result of having to earn their, to eat because of predation? I was part of a national discussion at the National Institute of Humanities about exactly this question. It was about carnivory and predation, and was asking if we had the genetic capacity to change predators, would it be a good thing to do? Could we do it? Do prey species suffer? Does the rabbit that's being caught by the bobcat or a lynx suffering? Do parasites suffer? That's an even more challenging question, because it goes to this fundamental question of human health. Do parasites suffer? And so from the Buddhist standpoint, all beings are caught in this, what we could call the drama of life, or in the dukkha of life, of striving to survive, to find food, to find shelter, to find safety if we can find it, to mate, to raise young and offspring, all of these elements. So the question becomes, what can we say about suffering among all beings, not just human beings? That's for your consideration. So I'm offering this story. This is from the author, the Canadian author, David Suzuki. And he's citing a Chewang tale. This is a tribe of people in Malaysia. They have a story that a tiger was stalking and trying to kill a family. And the Chewang people managed to kill the tiger. And when they did, a shaman came and and using shamanic powers, asked the tiger, brought him back to life and asked him, why were you hunting us? Why were you trying to kill us? And the tiger answered, all I saw was meat. All I saw was meat. Very telling comment, very telling for many of us as human beings too. But the question I was raising here is this suffering? And why am I asking that? Well, we know that there is such a there's a lot of understanding of trauma now, and in the world we know that there's something called perpetration induced trauma. Human beings suffer from it. For example, slaughterhouse workers working in slaughterhouses often suffer trauma. Even people who are relatively innocent, for example, veterinarians or veterinary technicians, suffer from trauma. So the question becomes, was the tiger suffering because all he or she saw was meat? Again, it's really a question for reflection or contemplation. But a lot of these questions I'm raising are really showing you some of the considerations I've been reflecting on. So human beings we love to define some species of plants and some species of animals as being weeds or pests. And because we've defined them as weeds or pests, they interfere with our human efforts to raise crops or livestock. They are sometimes vectors for disease. And the question becomes, is it possible to, and I previously mentioned the question, does a parasite suffer? Those are questions that are worthy to ponder, in my opinion. And here's the slide about perpetration-induced trauma that I just mentioned. So PITS, right? So what I want to do is offer some suggestions for personal practice. First of all, is simply, I was reading recently, I'm sorry I can't cite the source of it, that wisdom is a combination of intellectual effort and spiritual devotion, of insight that we arrive at spiritually, but also at knowledge we can arrive at scientifically or otherwise. So what I want to propose is that we all engage with a level of practice that focuses our attention not just on ourselves. And by the way, in my previous talk, I used the World Health Organization's model of the ecology of violence, which extends from the individual and from internalized violence through families, communities, neighborhoods, and larger entities out to the entire global Sangha of human beings. And then I suggested that we need to be thinking in environmental terms about a much larger ecology of violence. If we do that, it becomes very, very painful to think about the kinds of harms that we have perpetrated, that we continue to perpetrate in the world. We continue to perpetrate violence. But here's some suggestions for practice, and I'd like to offer these to you. These are things that I've been experimenting with. One is that during the COVID period, I did an entire personal history, an inventory of my relationships to all living beings throughout my life. I'm 76 years old, and I did a very careful review of my relationships to all animals and trees and plants, to all of those, and using my ability to recollect at what points had I been harmful, mindless, destructive, or had I been kind? It's not simply a negative question, but there have been times in my life when I have even risked my life to save animals. But looking at my own history is humbling. It requires humility on my part to accept that, particularly when I was a younger person, I was so unconscious about the presence of other life forms on the planet and of how they have consciousness, particularly as I mentioned earlier in that Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. So I want to suggest the process of inventory or personal history as one part of these practices. Another one is to take the metta practice, the loving kindness practice, and to extend it to all beings, not simply to ourselves, to those we love, to those we're neutral towards, or those that we find difficult, but to think about all beings and try working metta practice, just as an experiment, as a devotional exercise, to work metta practice, focusing on first friendly and familiar beings, like my cat who's sitting here next to me, listening to me talk away here, to neutral beings, maybe the small birds that I see outside, sparrows that live in the hedge a block and a half from here, and I don't have strong feelings about them. Then perhaps frightening beings. Some of us are very frightened by spiders, for example, or snakes. There are certain beings that frighten some of us. Because I worked in natural history, I tend not to be frightened by those. But then all actually harmful or dangerous beings. We have mountain lions in the mountains where I hike on a regular basis. No one has been hurt in the mountains that I hike in, but it could happen at some point. So what I'm suggesting is that the metta practice that we start with, where we start with people that we love, and then perhaps extend our metta and loving kindness to neutral humans, and then we think about those that we have resentments or judgments about. We can do the same thing with animals and with plants, with trees for that matter, by the way, for trees as well. This is an example of human cultures have long anthropomorphized. That is, we've attributed to other creatures human characteristics. They don't have, in my understanding, do not have specifically human characteristics, but they do have consciousness. They do have personalities. Any of us that have ever had a cat or a dog are very aware that these animals have personalities, that they have consciousness. And so it's important. And it's interesting to me that so many different human cultures have used animal tales as a way of conveying lessons. The Jataka tales in the Buddhist tradition are one example. Aesop's fables in the Greek tradition. And I've put a couple of examples here. One is the Wind in the Willows books from England, and the other is the Peter Rabbit books by Thornton W. Burgess, which were published originally in the Boston Globe in New England back around the turn of the 19th century. So here's another suggestion as an experimental practice. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Tonglen practice, but the Tonglen practice is described by Pema Chodron in the link that's on this slide. And Tonglen is a counterintuitive practice that, in my experience, requires considerable strength of heart. But instead of breathing in light and breathing out darkness, which in my opinion is equivalent to pollution, we're breathing in darkness. We're taking in the pain of others and using our strength of heart and our strength of body to transmute that darkness into light. And so we're breathing out light and sending love. And I want to suggest specifically that if you are familiar with endangered species, if there's a particular species, many of us are aware of the dilemma of elephants. I started out talking about Nalagiri, that it's possible to try a Tonglen practice with species that are suffering very greatly right now. I have tremendous feeling and compassion. I have a good friend that has spent most of her life working with elephants, I mean directly, firsthand, in zoos and then with the Humane Society of America, and then also working internationally. I'd like to suggest that Tonglen is a practice that we might be able to use to focus our strength and our attention on endangered species. And then finally, I just wanted to close with this. This, my dear, is the greatest challenge of being alive, to witness the injustice of this world and not allow it to consume our light. So it's possible, particularly in this era of climate change, of the 6th great extinction, which we're in the midst of right now. Earth has had 5 major extinction events to our knowledge, and we appear to be in the midst of the 6th one, where we're losing hundreds of thousands of species. Our dilemma is to hold our stance, to witness consciously and mindfully the damage being done to the world, and yet not to allow it to discourage us or defeat us. So I want to thank you all very much for your kind attention. That's my talk for this evening, and I want to thank Bhante Sumita for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for a great talk tonight. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
We consider plants as living beings, correct? Trees, plants, we consider them as living beings. When we kill plants accidentally, Is that mean that we are not obeying the first precept in Buddhism?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. You know, in my I mean, there would be a lot to say, a lot more than I can say right now. But first of all, no, in my training, I was been mostly in the last 20 years been working with the Thai forest tradition. We are responsible for intentional and volitional acts. So in other words, if we have the intention of killing and we have the freedom to do it, we're not being forced to do it by someone else, then there's not a karmic debt. It's still not a good thing. Of course, it's not good if we have to. But if the problem for us as Buddhists becomes when we are doing something intentionally and volitionally, and that's what really generates karma, or bad, negative karma. Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay, let's see. I think there's a question. Question from Bawani. I would like to know how you practice Kanti while learning and practicing Buddhism.
I'm sorry, I don't know what Kanti is. I'm sorry.
Bante Sumita. Patience. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. Yeah, sorry. Forgive my ignorance about that. But Kanti, patience, I actually use a meditation on a very regular basis there was a quite well-known paleontologist named Teilhard de Chardin, a French paleontologist, who was also, by the way, a Jesuit. And it's called Patient Trust. And it teaches me to be very tolerant and patient of myself, because none of us are born with complete insight and complete enlightenment. That's my experience. And we often learn by trial and error. So I think it's very, very important to practice with patience for ourselves, and to allow ourselves. One of my blessing practices for myself, you know, I do a number of different practices, but one of them is to ask a blessing for my imperfection. And that's how I learn patience, because I haven't met a perfect human being yet. even the ones that I love and respect very much, like Bante Sumita. You know, we all are in that process. We're still in a process of learning. So I wanted to mention, I saw a question come up about trees not being sentient beings. We are learning that trees actually do seem to have a kind of consciousness, and they communicate with each other. The latest science that we have is that we don't perceive them to be sentient beings. I understand that. And traditionally, we've not perceived them that. But trees do communicate. We have a lot of information now about how a grove of trees are using mycorrhizae, their roots, to actually send information back and forth to each other. So whether you call that, I think the question really is based in this issue of anthropocentrism. If we can free ourselves from the notion that sentience means having a human brain and thinking only the way human beings think, then perhaps sentience is a much more inclusive pattern. This science is quite new. It's being discussed right now. It's not exhaustive yet, not confirmed completely. But I'm just saying, my response to that question about plants and trees is based on new science, which I think we need to be respectful of. So.
Ananda has a comment. Professor, this is excellent. Thank you so much. As an easy practice, don't you suggest people to become plant-based?
It's a compromise, but yes. I mean, ultimately, the only thing that I think we could eat legitimately would be, you know, I sometimes say this flippantly, would be windfall, the fruit and nuts that fall off of trees, where we don't pull them off the trees, and animals that die of natural causes. You know, condors, for example, condors and vultures are carrion eaters. They actually live their lives, fortunately for us, by eating dead meat. But yes, and again, this is an area where plant-based diet is very, very important. It's very, very important because it moves us in a whole variety of ways away from the dilemma of how can you kill an animal? I want to say just one other thing. Here's an experiment I want to suggest for all of you. If you haven't done this, and probably a lot of people have, ask a little child, when a little child asks, well, what are we eating here? What is this? What is meat? And we tell them what meat is, they'll say, oh, no, I don't want to do that. Children don't approve of killing animals to eat them. That's been my experience, and I think most people have had that experience. And yet we develop a way of overriding that original tenderness and generosity of heart that we as small children have, and we end up eating meat. And we do it in horrible, the whole process, the meat industry, as I mentioned already, talking about trauma among slaughterhouse workers. That's just one piece of the horror that's involved in raising animals for slaughter.
Elenice really appreciates all your practical suggestions of including the inventory about how she relates to other and nature. She also has a question. What is important to hug trees? Do they have conscious?
Well, I talked about that a little. I don't know. I do it all the time. I hike in the mountains here in Southern California all the time. I talk to the trees. I pay my respects. Oh, and by the way, I don't know. I had a slide that I did not show, but Ajahn Pasano, who is my teacher at Abhayagiri Monastery. I haven't been up there during COVID, but he ordains trees. He actually goes out in the old growth forest and does a ritual ordination. He makes them members of the Sangha, old growth trees. And so whether the trees, I don't believe that trees have a consciousness of that sort. But again, my inclination is to try and be more open-minded about the varied forms of consciousness that may exist among all living things. And I will add to this that James Lovelock, who is the founder of who created the Gaia hypothesis, ultimately thinks that the entire Earth should be understood as an organism. And so how our brains and human consciousness fit into that pattern or that theory is a very challenging and interesting question as well.
What is your opinion about control over human reproduction?
Well, that's a very difficult question. You know, that there's no doubt. The Metta Karaniya Sutta, at least the version that I used in my talk, says those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. And so there's no doubt in my mind. I mentioned we hit according to the UN, we hit 8 billion people on this planet. And the growth in population, you can look at the US Census has a clock if you want to see exactly how fast human beings are being added to the planet, to the US and to the planet. I think it's a very difficult question. My own belief is that it requires consciousness and mindfulness, but there's no evidence, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary that human beings will continue to reproduce irrespective of that. But from a Buddhist perspective, I think there's a difficulty. Of course, it becomes it's not an absolute. And I believe, for example, that I think I shouldn't get too far into that discussion, but I believe that human beings, women, have the right to control their own bodies and have to make the best possible decisions they can make about how they're going to live with their bodies. And I'll just add that I think the question of when a child is viable outside of the human body is an interesting question. But my own belief as a Buddhist, I'll also add that taking a human life, for example, the question of euthanasia is something my teacher, Ajahn Pasano, declined to take part in a euthanasia ceremony in Northern California. I remember him telling us that. And he also was very active supporting people on death row at San Quentin. He has been in the past. So these are very problematic issues, I think. And so I wish I had a very complete, well-formulated answer. But.
So in relation of euthanasia, Professor, in your opinion, when we as a human being euthanize animals such as our beloved pets, for example, who is who is very sick and very helpless, is that not obeying the first precept of
Well,
Buddhism?
I can only tell you what I've done, and what
Yeah.
I've done is to care for a sick animal for a very long time. I had a cat that died. She lived for 1.5 years. She was very sick, and it was very difficult to treat her. She died right 4 feet from where I am right now. But we cared for her. We took care of her. We gave her comfort. We gave her support. My own intuition about that is that too often, for example, I will tell you this: veterinarians suffer from perpetration-induced trauma. That thing I mentioned, because they often are asked to put down healthy animals or animals that could live. And very often, for whatever reasons, families or individuals don't want to treat a sick animal on an ongoing basis, and they just don't want to have to pay for it, frankly. In my own case, my own cat, who's here with me now, has been recovering from cancer for 5 years. We've spent a lot of money taking care of him, but he survived for 5 years. He was given a 6-month diagnosis almost 5 years ago, and he's still here. And by the way, he's blind too. So,
he's very lucky.
Yeah. But I want to say, these are questions. I'm not in any way judging others for that.
Sure.
So if we have no resources and we can't treat the animal, it's very, very painful. It's just a very, very painful circumstance. So.
Sure. Okay. How do we define intentional or not? For example, if one needs one particular plant for treating a certain disease.
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think the way I've been trained in these questions is that there's a spectrum of harm, right? The harms that we do intentionally and volitionally may be relatively mild. For example, if I have cockroaches in my house, I have a hard time with that. I'm just be very honest with you. I have a hard time with that. But I do my best to keep the house clean. I actually take them outside, throw them outside. My neighbors may not appreciate that, but if there's a courtyard out there, they can try and survive. So what I'm saying is that there are a range of values associated with intentionality. And for example, the Buddhist monks in the Thai forest tradition, where I've practiced up in Northern California, will eat meat when they're sick. They treat meat, and that's in a way an answer to the question. The meat has not been killed for them, but they didn't kill it, and it wasn't killed for them specifically. But nevertheless, they are eating the meat of an animal that has been slaughtered, and they treat that as medicine. So it's a very similar question to the one I see on the screen in front of me. I don't feel, again, like some of these questions, I wish I had an absolutely, pat answer for you, but I don't always. In this case, I think it's a fair question. I think the main precept is not to intentionally be destructive and harmful. And then, in fact, if you look at the 5 precepts, there are interactions between them. It's sort of like none of the precepts are just absolute on their own. There are shades, and like the question of not the 4th precept of not being consciously deceitful, not lying to others. There are challenges to that. If I'm hiding a person who's subject to genocide and I have them hiding in my house, do I need to tell the genocidal people that they're there? No, I don't think so. I mean, these different. I wish all the precepts were absolutely black and white and binary, but they're not. They're just not. So.
Juliet has a comment. Eating meat makes humans get sick more than eating veggies.
I think so. I agree with that. By the way, when I mentioned that the monks were doing that, I didn't say that was my strategy. I'm saying that's what they did. They would take, but yeah, I mean that's a plausible position for sure.
Bante made a comment. Thai forest monks do wrap around trees in the forest, probably to preserve them from being cut.
That's right. And Ajahn Pasano actually ordains the trees. He ordains them as Buddhist monks. He makes them, and so the old growth trees. He actually, I thought I had a slide here. I didn't find it when I gave my talk, but there's a record of how, and he will talk about that. He actually would go out in the old growth forest in Northern California and ordain them. Yeah, same idea. And he's done it in Thailand too, where the Thai people have a very big problem with deforestation as well.
Kathy said, like the sequoia trees live thousands of years. Love to visit the sequoia trees.
I just made a visit to the Santa Barbara Botanical Garden. I didn't go all the way to the Sierra Nevada, but I looked at the coast redwoods. It's a spiritual practice. At Santa Barbara Botanical Garden, it's an hour from Los Angeles. I can go down into the garden, into the canyon, and the redwood trees, and I sit and meditate with them. I've done that many times. And by the way, they're not the redwoods aren't the oldest. The oldest are the bristlecone pines. They're 5,000 years old, and they live way up in the Sierra. And I've gone up and meditated with them too. I really believe in that practice. Yeah.
Buddha instructed the monks not to cut trees. Buddha had a great respect for the nature.
That's right. And he attained his enlightenment with next to a Bodhi tree, right? Yeah.
I don't know what MGTOW.
I don't.
All right. We cannot determine whether the other person or animal wants to die or not. Sabi sa tama wants kita may all beings be well and happy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Except that we do have a sense. We do, those of us that have spent a lot of time observing nature, it does seem clear that most animals, unless they're very, very sick, I mean, an animal that's very sick, often like cats will go off by themselves and find a place to die. But generally, when an animal is robust and healthy, it seems a lot of evidence that they're not sacrificing themselves. They don't want to die. All animals seem to have a life force. That's my experience.
Somebody asked, are you vegan?
No, I'm not, but I do pay very careful attention to whether the eggs have been raised in pastures and by free-range chickens. To me, the main problem with the way chickens have been treated, it horrifies me. I have chickens that are friends. I'll put it that way. But when they are allowed free range and they're allowed to have natural lives, as natural as they can under domestic circumstances, then I will eat eggs of that sort, but not otherwise. Yeah. And the same issue. Yeah. What we just saw the question about termites. That is an excellent question, isn't it? That is an excellent question. And by the way, I don't know. I used to be a member of the Social Insect Specialist Group of the World Commission on Species Survival Commission, which is the international body looking at termites, ants, and other creatures, other social insects. And it's a completely fair question. What do we do about that, right? There are treatments that are possible, but most of us, the apartment that I'm living in was built in the 1940s. And we've had termite problems in this apartment complex, right? So yeah, I mean, I didn't treat them myself, but it's a completely legit, and it brings us back to this basic question, which is that if our priority is maintaining property values, right? Or if our priority is really on gross national product, however you want to define personal wealth or gross national product, however you want to define it, there's a fundamental, and I floated in my talk. I didn't really develop it very fully, but I'm working on it. What would an economy of kindness actually look like, right? What does an economy of kindness actually mean? It's to me, a very, very challenging question, because as several of these questions there are all these contradictions, and how do we come to terms with them? How do we live our lives? Robert Aitken Roshi was a great Buddhist teacher. He was a Zen teacher who lived in Hawaii. He first of all was taken prisoner and went to the Japanese mainland and got to study Life, the very famous Zen, English Zen teacher. But he lived his whole life. He was a tax refuser. He refused to give a percentage of his taxes because about 50% of our money or more goes to defense. So he was withholding his taxes. Then he talks about looking down at his shoes and realizing that the sandals, the plastic sandals he was wearing, were made by Dow Chemical, who were manufacturing napalm and being used in Vietnam at that time. The point being that we are embedded in an economy, unless we somehow manage to go completely off the grid, to go out, and maybe even monks are not doing that, by the way. I mean, even monks are, you know. And so it's a very challenging question to ask. How do we ethically and morally, as Buddhists, how do we disentangle ourselves from this giant piece of machinery that is continuing to do violate, as I mentioned earlier, all five of those wrong livelihoods, our economy is doing all of those things, you know, in various ways. Poisons, manufacturing weapons, you know, sale of meat, sale of people, all of that. You know, particularly if you think about pollution as poison, pesticides, toxic substances in the air, and that's exactly what this question is raising, you know. And it's a fair question, you know, and I don't have a simple answer to that. But when we build houses, we can build houses without either by using wood that's been treated in some benign way, so it's not poisoning, and we can allow that termites may ultimately, you know, bring down our houses. We can build with stone or brick. There are other options like that, but there is no simple answer in my mind to that question. I wish there was. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I have experience going back to the tough decision that we had to make. When we bought our house, the garden has been planted with roses, and in Kansas City we have a lot of problem during warm weather of Japanese beetles.
Sure.
And it's very hard to get rid of. They're very stubborn, and I had to give up a couple of my rose plants because they were just all over the place, and I didn't have a heart to kill them all, but finally,
Yeah. I will tell you, as a child, I actually was paid to collect Japanese beetles off of roses. We paid neighborhood children. They paid us to go out and pull the beetles off of the roses. So there's a solution.
Okay. There's another question, I think. Tipitaka mentioned a lot that trees are shelter or occupy for the devas at a certain height. Not so much mention about that they have the 5 senses mentioned also in Ratana Sutta.
Right. No, I've never. I wasn't saying that trees have the 5 khandhas. You know, I was just saying that they, we're learning more and more about consciousness, and one of the places where deep ecology may affect our traditional Buddhist understanding is that we move beyond our fixed notion of what consciousness is as what goes on here or in my body in general, and we may have to recognize that there is a whole spectrum of consciousness in the world. And when James Lovelock talks about the Gaia hypothesis, he's saying, there may be some other form of consciousness at work too. One of my teachers has recently said, what we have going here is roughly the equivalent of an AM radio station, receiver, an AM radio receiver. We have very limited capacity to really perceive beyond that. We have the 5, the senses and the khandhas, but we have to open. I'm arguing that we need to try, at least experiment with opening our imagination to the possibility of other forms of consciousness, including trees, by the way. What that means, I'm not saying. I don't know. I've given an example of what we know. Right, we know that trees communicate with each other using mycorrhizae, the root systems, and they have chemical signals that they send back and forth to each other. We also know that some plants have the capacity to change their leaf form when they get browsed on. Like there's a plant right up here in the mountains above me in Los Angeles, that when deers browse it, they start putting out thorny leaves. They have smooth leaves before that. If a deer starts to eat that plant, the plant identifies that and starts putting out thorny leaves. That's a very interesting thought. What's going on there, right? So that's what I'm trying to argue. I'm just suggesting here that there are forms of consciousness that are beyond what human beings, what most of us conventionally think of as consciousness. That's all.
Sure. I think we skip a couple comments.
Okay.
Veganism is not a diet. And another comment, there's no such a thing as a vegan diet because veganism is purely a moral stance against the undue use and abuse of animals in any way, such as parading them in a circus or zoological park.
All right. Yeah. I'm okay with that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Again, everybody has their own opinion, right, on these.
Right.
Let's see, another. Okay, chemical fertilizer is a menace to the humans and animals and even to the nature. What's your opinion?
Yes, I agree. It's not just chemical fertilizer. It's the pesticides and herbicides that we use on crops as well. And there are examples. There's a great example. The Syngenta company paid a professor at Berkeley to do research on the effect of atrazine, one of their chemicals that has been sold worldwide. And he came up with evidence that frogs were being badly deformed by exposure to atrazine. And they began to attack him personally. They sent private detectives after him, and they tried to. That's happened again and again. It happened to Rachel Carson, the woman that wrote Silent Spring, a long time ago. But our friend, but what I wanted to say about that is the Syngenta, the company that manufactures atrazine and still sells it, also manufactures the chemotherapy that treats the cancer caused by atrazine. It's a perfect business proposition, right? You create something, causes cancer, and then you sell people the chemo that cures the cancer. And this is all well documented. This is not Tom's idea. This is true. You know, it's been written about very thoroughly. You know.
All right. Another comment. Ahimsa paramo dhamma. Non-harm is the highest religious principle, or non-violence is the greatest law. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
I'm down with that. I like it.
Elenise said, thank you for your reflections on such challenging topic.
Yeah. I just like to say that, you know, as I said at the outset, I'm floating this idea. I'm putting it out. I'm grappling with a lot of the implications that if we really look at combination of deep ecology and Buddhist precepts and Buddhist, broadly speaking, the question of what would an economy of kindness actually really look like, and practically speaking, what's the possibilities? You know, seems very a distant possibility to me, but unless we challenge ourselves to really think, and all these questions that we've been asked or looking at here, thank you all for those questions. Those are all part of this discussion. We have to keep talking, and we have to keep pushing the frontiers of our understanding, and not just our understanding, but of our action, so that we are beginning to act in ways that are fully consistent with our values. That's my belief. So.
Let's see. They continue, therefore only a strict vegan can claim to be an adherent of the eternal religion, Sanatana Dhamma.
Thank you.
In Ayurveda, is that how we say it?
Ayurveda, yes. Yeah.
Ayurveda. It said there's not a single plant in the world without being a herbal medicine. And another comment, the
As
Avatar
I said
movie.
earlier, yeah.
Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So. Oh, and the single plant in the world. Yeah, I mean, plants die. Like I mentioned, windfall. I mean, the question, of course, is, I think that the dilemma that we get into is that, for example, it's possible to trim a plant, perhaps, without killing it. I know that's certainly possible, but is that a violation of our precept to do that? I don't think so, but that's my opinion. Killing plants, on the other hand, and certainly planting thousands of acres of wheat, for example, and cutting it all and killing it all and disrupting the natural environment to create fields like that, that's a function of human population and demand for nourishment among human beings. We're caught in the middle of this machine that how we extract ourselves collectively from that process and establish some new paradigm is the open question, I think. Yeah. And what's most disturbing to me is, of course, because of my own background in history, is biodiversity. I spent over 20 years traveling all over the world, working on protected areas and endangered species, and it's extremely painful to see the continuing destruction of species.
The Avatar movie tells a lot related to the tree story. Well,
thank you for that reference. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor. Animal eating is not only harming the animals, but also creating lots of world problems, such as food and water shortage, human health issues such as non-communicable diseases, and environmental issues such as global warming. Do you have any suggestion as to how a person should embark on a vegan lifestyle?
Well, the best suggestions I have, are to eat low on the food chain. That's one of the suggestions, as much as possible. To support organic farming. We have many farmers markets here in Los Angeles, but I shop at a co-op where we have organic food. I buy almost exclusively organic foods, where I know they've been raised with care and not with the use of chemical pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers. There are some of those efforts that we can make, but how do we implement change? I mean, to me, the looming question is not. I think many of us can arrive at some set of personal values and personal habits that immediately seem to satisfy our ethical concerns. But the larger question, and the one that's raised by the deep ecology movement, is how do we transform an economy? The economy, this economic engine that we're embedded in. That's what I was saying earlier about Robert Aitken Roshi and the plastic shoes made by Dow Chemical, when he was withholding half of his taxes and putting himself at risk for prison by doing it. And yet he's still wearing plastic shoes. He's embedded, there are ways you can spend all your time doing that, but still the challenge for me really is, how do we look at systemic change? How does systemic change occur? And yes, global warming, climate change is certainly a major part of that. So how do we do that? That's the question we're all grappling with. Any of us that are conscious about these problems. Yeah.
I think we can conclude, Professor. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind attention. I wish I had more complete answers in all cases, but I don't. But thank you all for your kind attention. I appreciate very much the chance to be here. Thank you.
We look forward to meeting you again in the future with more interesting topics. Please contact us, Dhamma friends, if you have an interesting and useful topics you would like to share with us. We would like to again sincerely thank Professor Moritz and Bante Sumita to give us the opportunity. May you all always be well, happy, and healthy. We'll see you again next week at the same time.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.